I'm your host tonight, Tim. I feel like I'm like a restaurant concierge or something, or like a Vegas entertainer. I say that. Anyway, I am Tim. I'm the instructor type person here at the Old Sword Club. Also, I'm just generally kind of organisy type person. And tonight we're going to be looking at controlling distance and creating angles. So this is probably a slightly more advanced version of what we did the other week, where we looked at footwork and controlling distance. But the idea here is that we're looking at the skills of actually controlling the angle of the fight, controlling when engagement takes place, rather than just looking at sort of how do we judge distance. We're looking at how do we sort of line our opponent up. So the first thing we're going to look at is switching weight and using that to gather, using that to conceal how close we are to our opponent. So if I grab my sword here, when I come on guard, actually let's cover that. So in order to come on guard, what I want you to do, start with your feet in an L, with your sword side foot in front of your offside foot. Then from here, all you need to do is step so your feet are 2 feet widths apart. Bend your knees to a nice comfortable bend, and something that's actually quite relevant to maintaining distance and controlling angles is freedom knees of movement. And you want to start with bent knees as a way of making sure that your movement is free and easy. Basically, with human movement, when we walk, when we stand upright and we walk, we're essentially falling onto a leg and then using that momentum to carry us forward. And that's why you can walk all day, but usually like running for more than a little bit is tiring. And if you're running like a proper marathon, you don't actually sprint the whole way, you mostly jog to get to be a bit faster than walking. And the reason being is when we want walking is optimized for energy efficiency, whereas things like running, where you bend your knees and you basically propel off the ground, are better for explosive movement, for controlled movement, for any kind of high energy movement. In fact, starting from bent knees and propelling yourself forward is basically better for everything except energy efficiency, which is why was one of the reasons why we can't fence as much as we want. We get tired and need to go to the pub. So keep your knees bent so you can propel yourself forward, but also so you can control how you're moving. And a really, really good test I find is if you've got your knees bent enough, and if you're moving well, is if you line your head up with something horizontal, so those blinds, and then move back and forth and look at how much your head is dipping up and down. If your head is dipping up and down a lot, that's a sign that you're posting up on your legs, and so you've got very committed movement. It also makes your movement very obvious, whereas if I'm facing the camera, I can come forward, and because my legs are bent, it's a little bit less noticeable. It's a way of sort of concealing how far I'm coming forward, whilst also, while also getting close to my opponent, gathering on my opponent. So this kind of just like keeping your legs bent, having a nice relaxed bending your legs is really, really important to any kind of control distance or any kind of control of movement. If you struggle with this is something I did struggle with for a very, very long time. You probably do want to look into conditioning and fitness as a way of improving your ability to stay in a stance. It's a thing where we all sit at computers every day, and so we sort of waste away filling out spreadsheets. But if you can, doing things like squats, goblet squats, especially if you get some kettlebells, Turkish get-ups, deadlifts, all of those kinds of activities that help with legs and also core are really, really good for fencing. And if you can do things that are tailored for explosive movement, even better. So when I talk about weight shifts and gathering on the weight shift, what I mean is right now my weight is evenly dispersed between my feet. You can see the sword is pointing to roughly equal distance between where my feet are, or roughly the equal distance between my ankles. So I'm now mid-weighted. If on the other hand, I moved my weight over my back leg, you notice that my sword is now pointing not directly at my, my offside foot, but close to it. I'm now back weighted. If I make like this, now forward weighted. Sword fighting, I think there are some medieval systems that have a forward weighted stance. So if you do a medieval system with a forward weighted stance, do let me know in the comments below. But for the most part, particularly when you get to the early modern period into the Enlightenment, sword fighting is either done from a mid-weighted stance or a back-weighted stance, one of the two. I like mid-weighted because I like the versatility. Some people like back-weighted because it means that your body and all of your squishy bits are as far from your opponent as they can reasonably be, whilst you're still in a reasonable range of them. The reason why you're still in a reasonable range of them is what determines your reach when you're attacking is your back, or is the leg you're standing on when you move. So obviously, if you're doing a passing step, it's your front leg, but normally when you're doing lunging steps, like most early modern and post-Enlightenment era and post-Enlightenment systems, you're firing from your back leg. So what I want to do with my weight shift, if I switch from being mid-weighted to back-weighted, I haven't actually lost any reach in a reasonable attack. I never want to be so close to my opponent that they can hit me with just an extension, and that usually means sacrificing the ability to hit my opponent on an extension, on a straight arm extension in the process. So I'm probably going to have to lunge anyway, at which point my range is effectively measured, or the range of my attack is effectively measured from my back leg. The reason why weight shifts are important is if I can shift my weight, I can move my body further away from an attack and shift back. So here, my opponent can reach me, I can shift back and bring my body out of reach of my opponent while still being at the same range of them. And this is so useful. This is useful defensively, certainly. If my opponent attacks me, I can shift my weight back as a way of making them feel like they're too far away, making them feel like they can't quite reach me, and then prompting them to reach further and to overcommit, which is great. Or, one thing I like to do as a taller fighter, and this is definitely very much a tall trick, is I'll move back slightly. I'll just edge back as my opponent comes in so that they feel like they're out of reach and they start coming closer to try and stay within range or to try and be able to get me. At which point I will hit them with an extent. I will lure them into extension distance and hit them because they've gotten a lot closer than they realise, because they don't feel like they're in range when they actually were, and they're falling for my elaborate routes. So how do I deploy this kind of weight shift in movement? Let's say I'm moving back and forth, I'm stepping back and forth, keeping my opponent sort of guessing as to where I am. I find generally you don't want to just sort of walk up to someone, plant your feet, and then go, because you're giving them stable, very, very good ability to judge distance. What you want to do is move back and forth, also incorporate lateral movement, which we'll talk about a bit later. What I can do to deceive my opponent is, say, on a step forward, I can bring my back foot up but shift my weight so that it doesn't look like I'm quite as close as I am. So a lot of people judge how far you can reach based on what your body is in space, but if I can bring my back foot up without anyone noticing, I've gained the ability to reach my opponent, much further away. And this is something that shorter fighters can do if they've got like a tall fighter who likes to sit really, really far away with a massive long sword and just kind of poke at them. Just whilst you're moving back and forth, or in even lateral movement, shift your weight. So you appear further away than you actually are. And the way we can drill this is, let's just start off by moving our weight back and forth, just so we get used to this rocking action. But I want you to focus on pick a point on the wall, or if you've got something you can look at to measure where you are, I want you to focus on keeping your head level. So I'm actually looking at the computer screen right now and trying to keep my head level as I go back and forth. It can be really, really helpful to film yourself doing this, to sort of film yourself rocking back and forth to see how well you're concealing your movement. The other thing you can do is actually, if you've got like a full-length mirror, is do this in the mirror and look for signs that you're moving forward in the mirror and see if you can minimize those. Obviously, it can be a bit hard, and you want to do this. Don't do this in like a bathroom or something where you're very close to the mirror. Do it in like a bedroom where you can stand outside the room. So yeah, it's a bit less obvious. But this can also help you detect where your tells are if you're moving forward. And just look and just work on moving back and forth. So just gently back and forth. Now, to get a sense of how you deploy this, try moving, just stepping back and forth in whatever space you're in. So as far as you can go in one direction, as far as you can go in another. Now I'm going to call shift. When I call shift, I want you to shift your weight to be back weighted whilst you're still stepping, and then pause to see if you did it. So you should be able to just look down and see where you are in terms of your body in space. If you can't, if you're not used to sort of standing in these positions and just feeling it. And then back to your weighted. So let's give that a go. So let's start moving back and forth. We'll keep back and forth in our training spaces. And shift. And moving back and forth in our training space. And shift. Back and forth in our training spaces. And shift. And you notice as well, when I move, I'll even make my stance a bit small. So I've got a very narrow, a very, very narrow stance right now. And that's a habit point from bounding where I will actually, I'll start in this stance. And I'll actually, when I shift my weight back, I'll move my front leg as well to make it look like I've stepped. Because with any luck, depending on height and my opponent's peripheral vision, stuff like that, they might not actually be able to physically see my back leg. They'll only be able to see my front leg and my torso, and my back leg will be concealed, so I don't realize quite how far I've gotten away. So just keeping moving back and forth in the training space. So in there and shift. Shift back, shift. And stepping forward, and back, and shift. And back to guard. Alright, cool. I'm sort of firing through a lot of this because we started late. But if you do have any questions in chat, just type them down. I'll get to them as quickly as I can. Bill wants to know, actually that's a good question, Bill. What's the weight distribution between the front and rear leg? So you want to start off with, when I talk about where you're leaning to, you want to start off pretty even. So basically where the middle of my body is where my weight is. So right now it's even. When I do this, it goes back. When I do this, it goes forward. I like to start even because that gives me the most versatility in terms of sneaking back or even sneaking forward. Whereas, some people like to start very, very back weighted, basically because they're trying to play this sort of game of denial where they're keeping their opponent, they're keeping as much of their opponent, everything as far away from their opponent as possible. You see this with styles where they even have like retracted guards, these kind of really high guards and stuff like that, because what they want is basically to keep everything out of the way. All right, so next. All right, so we're going to look at using the weight shift to pull. So the idea here is that I want to pull as my opponent comes in, I'm going to parry, but I'm also going to pull back. I'm going to shift my weight back as a way of causing them to hit higher on my blade than they thought they were going to, or even I might just drop my blade like this as a way of being like, haha, you're even at a distance. And the goal of this is to make my opponent feel like they're too far away. So this is not like a slip. I'm not doing a big kind of movement like this. It's very, very obvious. Generally, when you're fencing someone who either retreats on a step or slips straight up in the front, it's fairly obvious. Slip is obvious. A retreat requires me to come further away from my couch, but A retreat is obvious. A weight shift, on the other hand, not so much. And you can see a little bit, like if you're watching, you can see a little bit, but when you're also worrying, when you're also having to judge a whole heap of other things, it can be a lot harder to notice exactly where I am. So what we're going to do this time, just starting from guard, I'm just going to use a medium guard because I like it. You can start from really any guard that you prefer using. What I want you to practice is just shifting your weight from mid-weighted to back-weighted as you parry. So from here, I shift from mid-weighted to back-weighted as I parry. 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 And mid-weighted to back-weighted as I parry. Cool. So that's how you pull, and the goal of that is to draw your opponent out, to make them chase you. Because when people are chasing you, and particularly when they feel like they need to come in, they're going to overcommit, which can make them quite vulnerable. I even had someone who I'd basically been pulling them along the entire night, and they got so close that I actually was able to poke them as they were preparing to come in because they always felt like they were too far away. And if your opponent keeps complaining that they feel like they're too far away, like your opponent says, starts complaining, you never come into distance. But you're always able to reach your opponent on an attack, even though they can't reach you. You know you're doing it correctly. So, a question. When you should. Is your front knee locked out? No, you don't want to. Bill asks, when you shift backwards, is your front knee locked out? And the answer to that is no. So you don't want to ever fully lock your knee out. You want to keep it as bent as possible. I tend to straighten it a bit because I find that I want to protect my height. I don't want to be bobbing up and down because that's really obvious. Instead, I want to keep, so I need to, as I'm moving backwards, I actually need to raise myself a little bit so it doesn't look like I'm getting smaller as I get further away. You never want to, you might want to keep your knees fully bent and just shift backwards depending on your height and what works for you. I mean, this is a thing you have to kind of play with your opponents to get the hang of properly. It's a bit hard to do unfortunately, it's a bit hard to do online. But you never want to fully lock your knee. And the reason for that is if you fully lock your knee, if I go to a full lock, my muscles disengage and I have to re-engage my muscles to start again. Whereas if I've got like even a slight bend, just a little bend, I've still got a bit of muscle tension and it's easier for me to keep moving. Whereas I find for a lock position, before I can move forward again, I have to unlock and then move. So I never want to fully lock. I want to go to this. And I know it's very subtle, probably a bit hard to see on camera, but you want to have just a little bit of bend. And what I suggest you do is when you're doing this, try and bring your knee all the way to a full lock position, and then just give it a little bit of a push to see where it pops to when you pop it out of that lock position. And you'll notice it's fairly obvious when it goes from locked to unlocked. Like it feels different from when you're otherwise bending your knee. And that's a really, really good thing to learn to feel because it's going to give you some body awareness. It's also going to teach you how to control your weight properly. Look. So next trick, and this is one of my favorites actually, is zigzagging to close. So let's say for the sake of argument that you have an opponent who is constantly backing off. They're basically back running. They're constantly trying to keep distance. You'll see this with a lot of very, very nervous new sort of like new offenses or beginner offenses. Is they'll constantly be wanting to back up because they've learned that being a bit further back gives them more time to make a decision because they don't really know, they've got a very small decision tree. Or because they don't really know how to go down the decision tree or like what decisions to make, what to look for. they're trying to slow the fight down by backing up because they're nervous. In fact, actually, even just like raw nerves can cause people to physically back away. As a weird side note, just because this thing, whenever I see it, I find it really funny. But if you're faced by someone who's got a spear, the spear is thought of as having a huge advantage over the sword. And this is true if you stand at spear distance where the tip can move quickly and they can plug you in and they can plug you unimpeded. The reason why it feels like the spear has such a huge advantage is because everyone instinctively backs off to try and work out what the spear is doing, and moves basically into the death zone and gets hit. Whereas one thing I actually found when I was fencing against people using a sword against a spear is if I could find a way to prevent myself from backing off, to stay in the fight, like to stay close, and actually like even come in and smother the spear with my sword, the fight became a lot more even. So yeah, that's kind of just, sorry, it was just a bit of a random aside, but yeah, I guess I'm a bit rambling tonight, so you're gonna have to deal with it. But yeah, so let's say you've got an opponent who likes to back off. They're running away. It's really hard to get anything going because they keep constantly retreating. They might even do like circular parries to tangle your sword up as well to make your life even harder. One thing you can do basically to close on them is to zigzag. Alternatively, if you're shorter than your opponent, or if you've got a shorter weapon, or if you're just like fighting at closer range, like you don't have as long a lunge, this works equally as well. What I do is I zigzag at my opponent. So I will make a slight lateral move. You see how I've come offline with my foot, and I'll even use the push, then bring my other foot the other way. And I might bring my foot back if I'm, if I decide I want this to be a new engagement, or I may even leave it out a bit to make it easier for me to then zigzag the other way. And I basically kind of hop at my opponent in this kind of wide stance as a way of making them chase or change their orientation. And the reason this works is I am changing orientation with one movement each time. Whereas my opponent, to move backwards, has to step and turn, or alternatively they have to turn and step. So for every two movements I'm making, my opponent is essentially having to make three, is the way it tends to roll out, which means that they're just that little bit slower than I am, or it means that I'm gaining a time on them. So the technique for it, I'll show you without a sword first. You should follow along. I sort of just assume everyone knows to follow along by now, but that kind of is not very beginner friendly for people who are like, why is he just talking like we're doing it? What's going on? So you follow along. The technique is quite simple. I step offline, bring my back foot up. I step again offline, bring my front foot up, back offline, front offline, back offline, front offline. Unfortunately, you can't do this backwards, and it doesn't really work backwards. So you're going to have to move from one of your training space to the other. But to show you that from the side, it's offline, 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 offline. Let's do it once more. I find it doesn't take too much practice to get the footwork down. What's the hard part is combining it with sword work, so we'll get to that in just a moment. But offline, 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 and offline. Into your wall. All right, now let's look at how I combine that with my sword work. So depending on all of this is going to very much depend on your opponent's guard. But what I find is when you're moving to your opponent's inside, you want to cover. And if you're moving to your opponent's outside, you want to attack. So for those who don't know sword terminology, my sword is on one side of my body. My sword is on, in this case, my right side, because I'm right-handed. Where I'm left-handed, it'd be my left side. The line that extends when I stand side on, out from my arm reaches straight, and both my heels and front and sword side toes are in line, is the center line of the fight. this isn't like, say, boxing with the centre line extended from the middle of your body, because your sword is only on one side of your body, not on two. So this is the centre line fight. Anything that comes this side of the sword is the outside. Anything that comes this side is the inside. Or as I like to think of it, the inside has more target area than the outside. Hence why if I cover my inside with a cart guard, my hand has to be further over because I actually have to cover my torso. Whereas with an outside tierce guard, I only have to make a very, very slight movement off the centre line to be protected. So if I'm moving to my opponent's inside, I find it works better to cover. You can have a crack at the wrist as you go. I find covering tends to work better. So what I will do is I will cover and move to, this case, a cart guard. Quite easily use like a prime guard as well. It's really up to you. And then when I move to the outside, I do this. I want to attack. I'm coming straight down and having a crack at the closest target, which will be the opponent's sword arm or weapon hand or whatever. And the idea is basically when I move like this, I'm covering because I want my opponent to need to reorientate and to want to reach quite far. The reason being is if they reach, I'll show you this from the front, my opponent reaches, they often bring their hand across the line of their body, which means I've got a chance. If someone's a bit sloppy, they might even attack me with an uncovered arm, like you see how. I'm straight onto the camera now, but you can see you've got a straight line to my arm. Whereas if I'm attacking like this, uncovered, if my opponent is trying to reach around my guard and my vulnerable bits has moved further away from them, so I'm circling around them, they might actually open themselves up. Whereas that doesn't really happen with the outside, and that's why I want to have a crack at my opponent. So I'm not going to get them to do anything by mistake necessarily, but what I do want to do is keep them busy or give them something to think about. You can do this with just solo attacks. You can just go attack, 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 and spiral at your opponent, basically just keeping them on the defensive. It's a good move. But yeah, I find that I find also drilling defend to one side, attack to the other gives you a lot more experience and skill in both. So let's try that. Coming on guard and whatever guard is you're using, and outside and attack, inside and defend, outside and attack, move back to the other end of the training space. I dream of one day having a sword hall of my own, just getting like a property out in the country somewhere, and having a training hall. But alas, I'm in the Inner West and in a small room. So we do what we can. But outside attack, inside defend. Outside attack, inside defend. And just doing your own time is probably easier. But yeah. I find this sort of motion is really, really good for running people down. And also just moving your sword, particularly if you've got a very timid opponent, gives them something to think about, to freak out about it. Right, so let's have a look. Any questions? So Bill said it looks like you're stepping to find the tip of the triangle to get offline. Yeah, pretty much. I'm just moving, or I'm kind of moving in a triangle fashion, I guess. Yeah, like if you imagine, there is a triangle. I'm moving from one point of the triangle to the next, and then to the next point of the triangle. So it is. I think there are systems that refer to this as a triangle step. I don't know the systems very well, so don't quote me. But this is certainly a thing. The other thing I'm doing as I move is when I want to go to my inside, I'm opening my hips, so I'm just pivoting in my hips. And one way I can move a lot faster, like I can zigzag a lot faster, is I can use the initial step to open my hips and then vault to the other side, so that I'm basically essentially moving very quickly to one side and then moving at normal speed to the other. As I find this has the effect of some people will feel like they feel like I'm actually moved. I actually look like I'm going to go on one way and then go on the other, which makes them feel like they're constantly catching up, which makes them move faster. And when they move faster, they panic more, and the more panic they are, the bigger their movements, and the easier they are to take advantage of. If that makes sense. So where are we up to next? Right. So let's talk about, right? So next we're going to look at what I call counter-traversing. So traversing is fairly common in green library systems, and then as you get to sort of the 1700s, it gets rarer and rarer, and then when you get to the 19th century, so 1800s, it sort of becomes this, it's a bit of a special technique. Like it's still there, but moving offline, moving laterally becomes less common. Whereas like in medieval systems, it seems to be the basic thing. And you even see like I see a lot of people in medieval systems start by just circling their opponent. The traverse is a pretty simple footwork. I'm just moving sideways, so all I do is I move my legs wide and narrow, and I'm actually turning as I go. So I'm tracing my target by pointing my toe at it. Sometimes I'll need to take into account an opponent is traversing. Sometimes I'll have an opponent who doesn't like fighting in a circular traversy fashion, and so just stands there to reline up. But I'm always moving to the side, and I'm always pointing my toes at my target. If I want to go the other way, notion is much the same. Just wide and narrow, wide and narrow, wide and narrow, wide and narrow. And you see how I'm now front onto you? Because I'm not just moving sideways, I'm turning, I'm actually moving in a circle. And the goal of this is kind of like the goal of zigzagging, where ideally what I want to do is get an angle on you, but that never happens in a fight. I think there's a lot of people like, oh, if you traverse a great line, then you'll have this huge angular advantage. I'm like, no, that never happens, because refacing and just twisting my front foot is a smaller movement. So you're never actually going to get that angular advantage on your opponent with just traversing. What you are going to do is move the fight in a circle, and that does have certain impacts on the fight, in that it basically, whichever side is, or the side on the same direction as you're traversing will be a bit safer. So if I traverse to my outside line is a little bit safer. It takes my opponent a little bit longer to hit it. And if I traverse to the inside, same deal, my inside is a little bit safer. And you see this in earlier systems. If I cover my inside, I want to traverse to my outside, so that way it's harder for my opponent to reach to attack my outside, and my inside is covered by my sword. So I've given myself a defensive advantage. The thing is, if you've got someone who wants to hunt you down and who wants to fight linear, and is perfectly happy to fight close, or perfectly happy to take the initiative in the fight by being closer and doing a thing, they can counter-traverse. So a counter-traverse is where you move in the opposite direction to your opponent. So if you think of traversing as both people move in this fashion, as you can see. So people, both might start here and they circle the same way, A counter-traverse is where one person, in this clever hand here, goes the opposite way. So you see how my hands are getting closer together because I'm traversing back. That is a counter-traverse. And what that does is it means that it does two things to the fight. One is it makes it linear again. If I counter-traverse, all of the advantages and all the dynamic produced by traversing are gone. We're a linear fight again. Because the things that you were trying to move away are close again. It's at the very least a very different dynamic, if not, and it's one that's much more similar to linear fighting than it is to circling each other. But the other thing I've done is move myself a lot closer. So what I find is if someone tries to traverse, what I might do, say someone's traversing this way on me, I'll traverse and attack. So let's possibly, let's assume a lunge, especially with, especially if you're using like a knife or something where you just don't want to walk into extension distance. And also just want to show off that I have a really cool dagger. It's like flexy as well, so it's like bounding safe, which is just awesome. You're still going to need to lunge, and doubly so if you've got someone who's fighting from a really, really far away. Like if you're fighting someone who does like Elizabethan broadsword sort of thing, they've got a really, really long sword and they're fighting for as far away as they can get because they don't want to give anything away. You move in on them and all of a sudden the game has changed and they tend to struggle. So what we're going to do is I'm going to traverse and lunge. Back to guard, traverse and lunge. And let's keep practicing that. Traverse and lunge. Traverse and lunge. Traverse and lunge. Traverse and lunge. Traverse, lunge, and once more for luck. Traverse and lunge. And if you do that in the fight, it's this is well into the category of things that are really, really hard to show with just me. But if you do that, you can actually just hit your opponent by surprise. Just move around and just bang, nail them. All right, so what do we have next? Right, so next we're going to look at rapidly changing direction. So one of the ways to deceive distance, and you see modern Olympic fencers do this a lot, is they'll change direction very, very quickly. So, I might have an opponent moving on me, I might be moving back, or I'll even deliberately come to engagement distance and then move back a bit, because one, people will either instinctively come forward because they're just like, oh, well, I need to keep engagement. A lot of people do that. The other people might be like, oh, Tim's backing off. Whatever he's doing, he needs more space. I'm going to cut, so I need to get closer to rob him of his ability to do whatever it is he's planning. In which case, but what I'm actually doing is trying to get my opponent to come forward and to feel like because I'm moving backwards, I'm not going to do anything. Because people obviously do step, like slip and cut, or even retreating cut. But that's always reactive. Attacking on the retreat is a reaction to something. It's very rarely done preemptively. People don't come on guard and step back and attack because that wouldn't be effective. The only way that would work is if your opponent is coming forward. So what I do to change directions is I stamp. I basically just stamp my foot. The way I like to think of it is I'm driving my heel into foot and just push it, and the same way I drive, or same way I really drive for a really, really vicious lunge. So just to show you that, if I'm over here, I step back, and I stamp. And you see I can launch myself forward. And this is a very, very ballistic movement, so it's very, very hard to do. It's very, very hard to do at a slow demonstrational pace. But all I'm doing is as I come back, or even I might even do it when I normally I might even just raise my foot and stamp back down, as opposed to lengthening it out to continue retreating. I'm basically just moving back and then stamping to fire myself forward. So let's practice that. So go to one end of your training space. And I just want you to step forward. Oh, sorry. Go that backwards. Go to the other end of your training space. Step back, stamp. And go to one end of your training space. Step back, stamp. And it does really need to be that kind of ballistic unexpected. So let's try it a few more times. So step back, stamp. And step back, stamp. Step back, and step back, step. One thing I actually find quite helpful with this is when I find that when I'm stepping, I tend to get up on my toes. I tend to raise my heels off the ground. I'll probe out with my front heel and roll onto it, but I'll otherwise end up with my heel a little bit off the ground, especially when I'm moving backwards. And I find keeping that little bit of heel raise, or thinking heel to ground is a really, really good cue to start the stamp. So if I move back to my wall, and from here, step, step, step. Back to here, step, 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 step. And once more follow up, this is quite tiring. Step, step, step. Right, so this is a fun thing to try. If you're using a thrusting weapon, the only things I'd note with this, if you're using a thrusting weapon, really make sure to raise or lower your hand to really pull the force out of it, because this is quite ballistic, and this is done when your opponent is coming forward. So you can't just rely on the flex of the weapon to not actually hurt your training partner. You also need, I usually recommend raising the hand as you do it. Like once you get contact, practice raising the hand so that you're bleeding off a lot of the impact and momentum through moving your hand up. Obviously you wouldn't do that in a real sword fight, but you can't get good enough to win a real sword fight if you enjoy your training partners along the way. If you're doing it with a cutting weapon, what I recommend is do it with a push cut. Don't use this as a chance to kind of strike down, because there will be more power in the blow, because you're reversing direction, and also because your opponent is coming in and possibly coming at speed. So you've got all of your momentum coming forward quite ballistically, and all of their momentum coming forward. It's a big collision, especially because a lot of these attacks tend to end up hitting quite high. You don't want to do an overly hard head, or don't overly hard hit to your opponent's head or neck. So if you're doing a thrust, I'm going to do this, step and raise. So steps, I'll step, and then when I hit, actually raise my hand, I let it drift up. And if I end up letting go of my sword in the process, well, I'd rather drop my sword by accident than hurt my training partner by accident. In a tournament, probably actually the same thing. In a tournament, you might have to ask the ref to check the video, but I still think it's better to minimize injuries in training, even if training in tournaments, than it is to actually hurt people to win. The only time that you should be hurting people to win is when you win by hurting people, which is not something we ever deal with in the modern day. And same thing with cuts. If I'm doing this, I'm stepping back, step. I'm actually letting my hand drift up once I get contact. So I'm punching forward. Once I get contact, I'm lifting up, which means most of the force of the impact is being bled off. By my upwards movement, and it's not embedding in my training partner's head. Because it's usually the worst impact you get in fencing when both people are coming towards each other at speed. With unarmed stuff, you can do this in boxing. Unarmed stuff, what I recommend is just keep your elbow bent so it collapses. Obviously, if you're doing this, if you're doing this in an actual fist fight, which is something we might actually get in the modern day, maybe you want to have as good an extension. Keep your elbow as in as possible, and even if your elbow is in like this, you've got a lot more structure than if your elbow is flared. Because in like this, it's very, very hard for something that hits front on. As long as your forearm is vertical on the punch, anything hitting front on will have a lot of trouble bending your elbow. Whereas if your elbow is flared, it's very, very hard to land front on, but any force that comes in this way, or like any force this way, or from your torso coming forward, whatever, is going to bend the elbow. So everything's going to, it's going to get bled off in movement. And The other thing you do, especially if you've got big gloves on, is rather than hitting someone in the face, is punch their glove. When I was boxing, one of the things I do to practice things that are very, very hard to, or punches are very hard to pull, was rather than targeting at my opponent's head, I target their gloves. I just smack them in the gloves as hard as I could. It was more than a few times I caused people to punch themselves in the face, but because they weren't actually hurt or in any way harmed, it was really, really funny. Like, it wouldn't have been funny if they actually hurt themselves, but just them sort of gently punching themselves in the face because I punched them really hard in their own glove through my glove. That was, that's hilarious. Yeah. But yeah, just something to be mindful of when you practice this. The next thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at what I term ripping. So this is a way of increasing your speed, your forward momentum. This is also something you see a lot in Olympic fencing. So go watch particularly foil and sabre, less so épée, but with foil and sabre, you'll notice people will move back and forth, and then every so often someone will time a stamp really well and just land some amazing counter thrust. And with and also with Olympic foil, and also sabre actually, they petard offline so they can't be hit because they don't have priority. Just smash their opponent with this incredibly hard thrust. But yeah, you'll see it a lot, and it's really cool. I also suspect that because of these kinds of high velocity attacks is the reason why was a big part of the impetus behind making Olympic weapons so flexible. Like, I suspect that you find that there's always a move to make them more flexible, even before electric scoring came in, and just the flick was a side effect of that. It was something people discovered they could do after the fact, primarily because you need the flexibility to be able to flick, and no one knows to flick until they can until they can do it. So that got brought in. I think I'm pretty confident flexibility preceded flick. In which case, as a as like a bit of a historical thought, the probable reason is that they were doing more and more sort of high amplitude attacks. Probably also because some footwork is very, very surface specific. Smooth surfaces like this, and also actually find concrete and asphalt. It works really, really well, like this high amplitude stuff, on things like wet grass, or as on wood chips the other week. I went to do a bunch of this stuff to rest my opponent, and my foot moved, but nothing else did. And I'm like, I really need to stamp down to actually get any kind of movement on the surface. There's my foot. But anyway, ripping. So the idea with the rip is I'm basically pulling my front leg along. So I am essentially doing this, pulling very viciously. But the idea is that doing that pull motion will pull me really, really vigorously. It actually propels me forward because most creatures pulling is generally stronger than pushing. Like anything, primates climbing, it's easier for them to pull themselves up than it is to push something away. In fact, if most people can it's easier to do a chin up than it is to lift the equivalent weight by pushing. And the reason why is just pulling tends to be a bit stronger. So I can use that to propel myself forward. All I do is I basically extend my foot out like I would for a normal step or for a lunge, for a kick of a lunge, except instead of rolling and lunging and then bouncing back, or rolling and stepping, what I do is I basically just lift my back foot up to propel it along. This isn't in of itself a very useful motion. I know a lot of people see this and they're like, but get the little bit of extra speed you get is not worth the incredible instability and commitment of this movement, which is true if I were doing this, where I come on guard, I extend and pull, and fire myself along. But this isn't when you use this movement. use this movement as a way of accelerating. So, to see what I mean, instantly this kind of footwork is also something used in small battling areas. The good part is that you don't need to. The bad part is if you did, you'll probably crash into something. So yeah. Let's say I've got an opponent who likes to run. They like to back off. And I don't want to just physically start running after them because that's very committed and the acceleration on that is actually quite slow. To go from standing to full speed on a run takes a few steps. Even you watch Olympic sprinters, they don't hit top speed until 2-3 steps. This mechanism, with this, I'm accelerating a lot faster. So what I do is step, immediately my opponent is really backing off, or particularly particularly if they're actually using their retreat to gain ground, they might be making a really big step to get even more space. So as I said here, crashing my own wall, but I use that as a way of accelerating myself. And accelerating myself forward to address any kind of lost distance. So let's practice that. So I'll do a step, and then extend out, and back to the outside of the training area. Step, and extend out, and ready. And back to the new training area. Step, and extend out, and ready. Step, extend, and grip. Step, and extend, and grip. And once more for luck. We can see how much energy I'm actually getting by coming forward, and when you're in a bigger space, this is not as problematic. Step, and grip. Cool. So we've now got a really, really cool way to chase people down. Right, so I'll just check if there are any questions while we're going. All right. Cool. So we've talked a lot about closing distance. And when we talk about opening distance, for the most part, it's pretty intuitive. Most people will instinctively know to back off, and it's felt just to take a step backwards. And there are other methods of kind of keeping your opponent at bay or keeping them, keeping them back. But I don't use a lot of them, and because I'm tall, they very, very rarely get used at me. And I do want to be open about the fact that there are just some considerable weaknesses to, there are some limitations to my knowledge. I can only really know the things that I do and the things that I have seen done. And yeah, basically most of the situations I fenced with, all of the people who wanted to gain ground on me have used sort of some of the methods I've described, which are also things that I've in turn used when I want to gain ground on people, like those things I copied. In terms of keeping distance, for the most part, I find either just weight shifting to get a bit of space or just stepping physically backwards is usually enough for me. I've never needed to really make a concerted effort to stop my opponent from coming in, except when I've needed to keep them at bay when playing parry riposte. If I've had someone coming in at me quite aggressively, what I find is having a good riposte to just keep them, basically to make them not want to stay in distance is quite helpful. So one thing you can practice is just practice different parries and see what your fastest riposte is. I find with things like cart and tier, so these very, very common parries, a cut number 7, coming straight down the line, is the quickest. With prime parries, coming with a number 7 cut is usually the quickest as well. Second, I find just thrusting, which is straight up with a thrust. Septime, same deal, just poke straight back. In fact, probably 9 times out of 10, the fastest riposte is either a vertical cut or a thrust, depending on what you're doing. And then riposting with other cuts is really a way of opening up your opponent. So having a quick riposte is good, but the best riposte I find for keeping someone at bay, or to like stop someone from basically bearing at you, is to cut low, is to cut to the thigh. Normally you don't cut to the thigh, because if I cut low like that, my opponent has a direct line to my sword hand, and so they can just pull their leg out of the way and whack me. But if they're occupied with, if they're busy trying to cover themselves against my riposte, particularly if I've riposted high because I've got a quick, sort of cut number 7 riposte, going parry and then swiping at their leg quite aggressively. Usually what that will do is force my opponent to slip or to step back to protect their leg, at which point I've created space. So this is kind of my one kind of keep your opponent at distance trick, is just throw a low riposte at them to keep them at bay. And I do kind of feel like if you're needing your opponent to back up more than that, then you need to probably look at the problem. There might be earlier, that's a sign that there might be earlier problems in your game plan, in terms of how you're engaging your opponent, or a sign that you're having trouble with judging reflexes. So yeah, this is my advice, is parry riposte low as a way of getting your opponent to back off, because, or particularly parry fast riposte, parry low riposte as a way of getting your opponent, to just move back, to just stop bearing in at you. So yeah, how you do that's going to be very technique specific. I don't really know how to teach that. Normally what I do to teach that is I get everyone to bow, and I have one person whose job it is to bear in, and the other person whose job is to keep them at range. And something I find really, really good for that is, you give one person not this short, but a shorter weapon, and the other one a longer weapon. I don't really have my buffers here, but I do have 2 bits of buffer that I use for buffer bounding that I find is really good for that purpose. Because the person with the short buffer has a material incentive to come closer, and the person with the long buffer has a material incentive to keep them at range. Or you just bow, or you even just get people to role play. And one of the things, I very much don't, as much as I don't think that everyone who trains to fence should instruct, or should feel like they need to be a teacher, like teaching and fencing various different skills. If you are going down that path, like if you find that you enjoy teaching, or you find that, actually usually a good sign that you probably end up teaching is if you're the sort of person who needs to explain something to someone else to really get it to click for yourself. I had a person like that in class where he basically, once he got past sort of really beginner level, he was quite good, because you just put him with the newest person in the class, and that way they got some extra instruction and he got to talk it through, which was good for him. But yeah, if you're going down the path, if you're thinking you're going to become an instructor one day, or you're already an instructor and you want to be a better one, learning to fence different ways is quite helpful, because being able to sort of step into it and go, all right, I'm just going to be really aggressive, and really try to close my opponent to force them to make me back off. That's a really, really useful way to teach you stuff. The other side of that is you don't really need to be particularly good at it, you just need to be able to do it. I'm not very good at it. I'm actually not too bad at aggressively closing, but just that kind of that raw sort of high pressure energy, like that really kind of pressure fighter approach, I'm not so great at. But that is, me being not great is actually a bit of an asset when I do it, because it means that once my opponent gets the hang of keeping me at bay, they start winning very, very frequently, which reinforces that lesson. And positive reinforcement is just really good, really good fencing. All right, so we're getting towards the end. If anyone has any questions, that would be great. I'm going to have a sip of tea. But yeah, there was one other thing I did want to mention before I finish up. So I did mention before that if you're finding you're backing up a lot, like you're finding that you really need to keep your opponent at bay, that's a sign that you're either having problems with judgment or reflexes, or that you've got a bad game plan. Basically, so in terms of game plan, first step is ask yourself what your game plan is. And if your reaction was hit the other person or to say anything very generalized, that's a sign you don't have a game plan. That's a sign that, like if I say to you, what are you trying to do in this fight? And you say hit the other person, you might want to rethink, you might want to think about explaining that in a bit more detail, like how you're going to do it. Like for me, my game plan is I'm going to hit the other person on a riposte. In order to do that, I need them to attack. If they're aggressive, then I'm sweet. If they're defensive, if they're trying to do the same thing back to me, I'm going to start sniping at their sword arm, or increasingly now throwing attacks with really aggressively heavy opposition to get them to riposte me, at which point I counter riposte them. Does that mean that I won't use other things in my fencing? Hell no. If I see the opportunity to throw a feint or to do a beat or to do something like that, I will do it. But I am coming to every engagement with a plan in mind. And if you find that you're constantly backing up, and it means one of two things. One is your plan requires a lot of distance, in which case it needs to be aggressive, like it needs to initiate as soon as your opponent has come to that distance. Or two, it means that you're not sure when to implement it, in which case you probably want to change your plan, find something that's really simple to implement. I recommend forearm sniping, or just like a 1-2 feint my opponent has come close, has come into distance, attack their sword arm, or I'm going to throw a 1-2 feint as a way of getting them to back off, or getting them to do something so that I can start to implement my plan. Jacob, who I don't know if they're watching, they may not be, but Jacob started using beats for exactly the same purpose. Like Jacob, when it's Jacob, the first thing Jacob will do is try and strike my sword aside or try and disrupt it in some way to get a reaction out of me, which means that Jacob can then do whatever it is that he's planning to do. Thing number two is it might be a question of judgment, like you're not sure what's going on, in which case the best thing to do is do some slow speed bouting. I honestly don't recommend starting with slow bouting. I think slow bouting is a drill rather than a slower form of bouting. It is a level of abstraction, but it is still a very, very useful thing to do if you're not sure what's happening in the fight, you're not judging it properly. Slow it down so you can see what happens, and you can replay, and you can ask your training partner to replay things so you can really get an idea of what they're doing. It is really, really helpful. So it's about just going slow. That's a really good way to build judgment, and you can also make this as specific or as general as you like. So one of the drills I do a lot of is the slow riposte drill, where we just practice parry, riposte, very slowly, to get a feel for the dynamic of playing parry riposte and how I can use one riposte to set up another down the track. But I also do slow bouting. I do slow bouting across systems. I do slow bouting across weapons. You're just slowing things down to get an idea of just how they're going to work. And that's a really good thing to do if you're finding you're struggling with judgment, especially if you find that you're fencing across systems a lot. So like if you do, say, 19th century British sabre, and all of your friends do, like 18th century French espadon or whatever, judging things is going to be hard because your opponents are not giving you the sort of stimuli that you're expecting. So slowing things down can be good. Final thing is a question of reflexes. And this is something I've been working on at home because it's something we can do a lot of at home. All you do is get a tennis ball, which I'm holding on. This is my living room, it's not a particularly big room. And to start off with, I just go to a wall, I throw, I drop the ball. I knew I was going to screw this up as soon as I demonstrated it. But I throw at the wall, I just catch it, changing my hands as a way of developing hand-eye coordination reflexes. And And then if I get too successful at that, like if you get 10 in a row, change something up, either throw harder so that the ball is coming back faster, or move further away so that the ball has more chance to sort of go to just other places. There's more variation where it can move to. The one you want to do is the one that you're worst at. So if you're struggling, if you find going faster is not an issue, like you can just bash the ball against the wall repeatedly and annoy your housemates or partners or kids, pets, maybe, I don't know. This is very, very hard to do if you have dogs, just saying. Then you want to try moving further away, so there's more variation where the ball can bounce to. Whereas if you find that moving further away is not, you can catch it. Try moving close, try doing things faster, like throwing harder so that the ball's coming back faster, make it harder for yourself. And you basically want to get it to the point where you're succeeding, or you want to get, you want to basically move to something harder every time you get like 10 in a row, because that's a sign that you're doing too well, and you need to level up. If you find, once you're sort of getting decent at that, not even necessarily good, like you don't have to be perfect at it, a really good variation I found is you throw a ball and then you lunge to catch. And that way you're practicing a lunge as well, and you're adding a bit of so you're adding a footwork dimension and movement dimension to it. I did a lot of that when I first moved into this place, just to didn't have anyone to fence with. And then when I finally got to fencing about 2 months later, I found that my reflex and my hand-eye coordination improved drastically, which is a sign of one of two things. Either this is a drill that can help someone who's been fencing for a fair while, or I just had really poor hand-eye coordination the whole time and managed to compensate. One of the two, but it's enough. And this is a good drill that you can do at home, and it's a really good solo drill. I just wanted to add that in because I thought that was kind of cool. That's my closing thought tonight. So, I hope you all enjoyed tonight. This is pretty much the end, unless anyone has any questions. We are going to be jumping on Zoom after this. So if you want to come join us in Zoom, address should be on screen now. And if you enjoyed this lesson and want to sort of contribute to us basically surviving under capitalist landscape that we're in, consider donating to the Old Sword Club. Link for that should be in the description now. Other than that, I will let you know when we'll have the next event up fairly soon. So I don't know what we're doing next week yet. Probably actually when we're in Zoom, we'll even have a little bit of a chat about that. But thank you all for coming. I will see you next week, and